In this video, I'm making a holster, and in a surprising turn of events, it's one I've already got a pattern for, so I get to skip that step. It's kind of an unusual shaped holster. It's a cross-draw pancake style for full-size automatic pistols like the 1911. And I'm cutting this out of 8 to 9 ounce Herman oak leather. I'm probably going to line it with about 3 to 4 ounce leather because I like the totals to add up to about 10 to 12 ounces total on the pieces that it's going to be made out of. You might go a little heavier for large Western style holsters. You might go lighter for small compact firearms. Maybe as low as 6 to 8 ounces on those. But for this, it creates a real nice, stiff, heavy holster that holds its shape well. It is a little harder to form and shape than a single layer of about 8 ounce leather would be, like you'll sometimes see manufacturers make holsters out of. So you won't get it to print exactly to the gun most of the time, even if you vacuum form it. But I don't think that's actually very necessary. I tend to tool or stamp on the outside of the holster, and I don't want to mess that up anyway. So all the pieces are, as usual, cut out with a round knife. I use hole punches in any of the inside of corners so that I can keep from cutting into the leather where it doesn't need to be cut. I also use hole punches where I'm going to be cutting out the belt slots at each end of that, so that I can just cut between those holes that I've got punched. And you'll see I always kind of cut away from holes and out. Again, like I said, so I don't leave a nick or a notch on the edge where there might be a weak spot. And when I cut the slots, it's cut in 4 different cuts. 2 for each side, cutting away from the holes again. You don't cut into the hole because you might slip and go across it. And again, like I said, that cuts into the leather and you could create a weak spot. Then this is the lining leather, so it's just going to be plopped down on there, kind of reversed to what the other piece was, and I'm just going to rough cut around it. I don't want to cut anything exactly to shape because I want to glue it all up and then trim it to shape. I found that if you cut it exactly to shape, and even no matter how careful you are while you're lining it up, you're trying to glue it together, first off, contact cement can be a real pain to try and glue something together and get it exactly placed. It's a whole lot easier if you can just kind of roughly place it, because it tends to stick as soon as it touches. But also, the leather also tends to seem to relax and stretch out a little bit sometimes in odd places when you put the glue on it and when it soaks in. So a perfectly cut piece may not line up perfectly anymore once you put the glue on it. So it's best just to cut it a little oversized and then trim. So now we're doing some stitching grooves all over around it. Any place that's going to be on the outer surface. Beveling edges, at least the first time. It'll need to be beveled again probably after I get it all put together when I'm going to go finish the edges, because I'll sand those edges to match each other. Now this I'm marking a stitch line that I'll need later for when I actually stitch it together to make the pocket for the firearm to fit in. Alright, now we get to the stamping, so we're going to wet it down. I marked the line just a little bit ago, and I was just double checking it there, making sure that it was visible enough to see what I was doing while I do this pattern. And the line is set up to line up with the belt that's going to be going through the slots in this. That's why it goes across at an odd angle, because I've made a belt also for the same customer with the same pattern and the same color, and the pattern runs lengthwise on the belt, so I want it to run parallel on the holster to the way that it runs on the belt. One of those details I don't always notice myself and don't always pay attention to and get right, but in this particular case, I've managed to remember it ahead of time and laid everything out to where it'll match. I'm not sure if the customer would even notice, but I do. As usual with all these stamping tools, it's once you lay the line down, it's pretty much just they fit together. Until you get to an edge, you go ahead and do partial impressions near the edge, and then you go around with a camouflage tool or a border tool of one sort or another and cover up around those edges. And I'm using a glass burnisher there to slick it all down. And we're going to jump through the dyeing steps real quick here. This is a water stain that I'm putting on it. Again, like I said, it's to match another belt that I've already made for the customer. Actually, I've already made another holster just like this one for the customer. This one's right-handed. The other one I made for him was left-handed. Got both of our outside pieces, both of our lining pieces. All of them need to be stained. All of them need to be finished with, again, Resolene in this case. One of my favorite finishes. I think it's a really durable finish that holds up well. If you kind of apply it with a sheep wool scrap and sort of lather it up, I've gotten good results with it. I've seen people try to put it on with wool daubers and so on and get terrible results where it speckles and spots and bubbles up. And we're going to do a few cuts to kind of jump through all the spread and glue. Basically, absolutely everything on the flesh side of it, cover it with glue on all 4 pieces. Again, this is contact cement. Most of the leather workers out there will recognize the red and yellow can, know what it is. And once you get it lined up, it just kind of sticks instantly. Basically, you want nice thin layers of glue. Don't glob it on. Get it nice and even. And let it pretty much look like it dries. It actually stops looking glossy for the most part. And then it's ready to go. And that's when you line everything up as carefully as you can. Stick it all down. And this is where I said it would be a real pain to try and stick together if you had everything perfectly sized. But we can just go on back and on that thinner leather, punch a few holes, trim it all to match the edges. Now it's downstairs to the sewing machine to get it all put together. Now anytime you line a holster, one of the disadvantages of doing it is you have to stitch all over around it. Any of those edges, you have to stitch them together so that they don't peel apart over time. So there's a lot of extra little spots you need to stitch before you just stitch the holster together. Not really an issue if you have a nice sewing machine. Now we get to the point where we're actually putting the holster together. And this is that stitch line that I marked straight, that just marked off the edge of the pocket. One of the advantages of the pancake style holster is since there's two layers like this that are sewn together, when you open it up, it creates kind of a natural groove for the sights of the firearm to fit in, so it doesn't drag. Especially some of them that have really sharp front sights on them will catch in holsters and tear up the inside of the holster, or just drag and not be easy to remove from the holster. Whereas this pancake style kind of creates a nice little slot for everything to fit through. Once it's all sewn up, I'll take it over to a belt sander and try and sand off some of the edges to smooth it all up and make them all match each other. Again, I don't try to get them perfectly matched to start with. I count on coming back and sanding them to match. And I only cut one side of this slot, just the top part of it. So I'm back now and I'm punching holes and cutting through the bottom layer of the leathers. Again, so I didn't have to try and line it up perfect in the first place. Now this is what I was talking about earlier of going back over the edges and rebeveling in some places where the sander took a little bit more off to line everything up. Then it's taken some stain and restaining the edges all the way around, and then we're going to use some gum Tragicamp and smear that on the edges. That's the burnishing compound, so that we'll be able to burnish the edges nice and smooth, which is the next step. Go back over it with the wooden slicker, burnish everything down. Again, all the way around the holster. Don't forget the little slots that are where the belt loops go either. You want those to feel nice and smooth too. Alright, now we've got a holster pretty much done all together. The only problem is it's totally flat. So after we got the edges all nice and smooth and ready to go and pretty much everything's finished, it's going to be time to shape it. So I'm going to toss it in some water and wet it down. There's several different methods you can do this. You can, if you're making a lot of holsters of the same type, you can use a blue gun for it. If you've got a gun on hand that actually will fit, this is another method. You can just get some plastic wrap, cellophane or whatever you want to call it, and take the firearm itself that you're going to be fitting the holster to, in this case a 1911 variant. Make sure it's unloaded, as you would with any firearm when you pick it up, and you wrap it up in the plastic wrap. This protects the gun from the water that's in the leather, because we don't want to rust the gun out. It also adds just a little bit of extra space so that the holster doesn't fit exactly perfectly, so it's got just a little bit of extra room. And you can pretty much just kind of, once that holster has been really soaked in water for several minutes and is totally soaked through, it just molds like clay. So you can just sort of put the gun on in there and shape and mold and squish it with your fingers until it's all just fits perfect. This does, of course, rely a little bit on your pattern being right to start with. And if you're doing this method for someone else, there is a possibility that you could just take some plastic wrap with you and meet them at a gun shop or a range and mold the holster there to their particular firearm if you don't have one that matches it. And I've done that many times. It does take a little bit more confidence in your ability to make a pattern, to make one from just a tracing, and then to actually, in front of a customer, be the first time you find out if it's going to fit or not. But in this case, like I said, I had a firearm that fits it, so I can go ahead and make sure that it all fits nice and neat while I'm still here on the bench. And once you got it shaped, it's just a matter of letting it dry. And here's the finished product.